He seemed about to faint again. Dale rose and came over to him, with a sympathetic movement of her hand. "You don't remember how you were hurt?" she asked gently. The unknown stared ahead of him, his eyes filming as if he were trying to puzzle it out. "No," he said at last. "The first thing I remember, I was in the garage, tied." He moved his lips. "I was gagged, too. That's what's the matter with my tongue now. Then I got myself free and got out of a window." Miss Cornelia made a movement to question him further. Beresford stopped her with his hand uplifted. "Just a moment, Miss Van Gorder. Anderson ought to know of this." He started for the door without perceiving the flash of keen intelligence and alertness that had lit the unknown's countenance for an instant, as once before, at the mention of the detective's name. But just as he reached the door, the detective entered. He halted for a moment, staring at the strange figure of the unknown. "A new element in our mystery, Mr. Anderson," said Miss Cornelia, remembering that the detective might not have heard of the mysterious stranger before, as he had been locked in the billiard room when the latter had made his queer entrance. The detective and the unknown gazed at each other for a moment, the unknown with his old expression of vacant stupidity. "Quite dazed, poor fellow," Miss Cornelia went on. Beresford added other words of explanation. "He doesn't remember what happened to him. Curious, isn't it?" The detective still seemed puzzled. "How did he get into the house?" "He came through the terrace door some time ago," answered Miss Cornelia, "just before we were locked in." Her answer seemed to solve the problem to Anderson's satisfaction. "Doesn't remember anything, eh?" he said dryly. He crossed over to the mysterious stranger and put his hand under the unknown's chin, jerking his head up roughly. "Look up here," he commanded. The unknown stared at him for an instant with blank, vacuous eyes. Then his head dropped back upon his breast again. "Look up, you," muttered the detective, jerking his head again. "This losing your memory stuff doesn't go down with me." His eyes bored into the unknown's. "It doesn't go down very well with me either," said the unknown weakly, making no movement of protest against Anderson's rough handling. "Did you ever see me before?" demanded the latter. Beresford held the candle closer so that he might watch the unknown's face for any involuntary movement of betrayal. But the unknown made no such movement. He gazed at Anderson, apparently with the greatest bewilderment. Then his eyes cleared. He seemed to be about to remember who the detective was. "You're the doctor I saw downstairs, aren't you?" he said innocently. The detective set his jaw. He started off on a new tack. "Does this belong to you?" he said suddenly, plucking from his pocket the battered gold watch that Beresford had found and waving it before the unknown's blank face. The unknown stared at it a moment, as a child might stare at a new toy, with no gleam of recognition. Then, "Maybe," he admitted. "I don't know." His voice trailed off. He fell back against Bailey's arm. Miss Cornelia gave a little shiver. The Third Degree in reality was less pleasant to watch than it had been to read about in the pages of her favorite detective stories. "He's evidently been attacked," she said, turning to Anderson. "He claims to have recovered consciousness in the garage, where he was tied hand and foot." "He does, eh?" said the detective heavily. He glared at the unknown. "If you'll give me 5 minutes alone with him, I'll get the truth out of him," he promised. A look of swift alarm swept over the unknown's face at the words, unperceived by any except Miss Cornelia. The others started obediently to yield to the detective's behest and leave him alone with his prisoner. Miss Cornelia was the first to move toward the door. On her way, she turned. "Do you believe that money is irrevocably gone?" she asked of Anderson. The detective smiled. "There's no such word as irrevocable in my vocabulary," he answered. "But I believe it's out of the house, if that's what you mean." Miss Cornelia still hesitated, on the verge of departure. "Suppose I tell you that there are certain facts that you have overlooked," she said slowly. "Still on the trail," muttered the detective sardonically. He did not even glance at her. He seemed only anxious that the other members of the group would get out of his way for once and leave him a clear field for his work. "I was right about the doctor, wasn't I?" she insisted. "Just 50% right," said Anderson crushingly. "And the doctor didn't turn that trick alone. Now," he went on with weary patience, "if you'll all go out and close that door." Miss Cornelia, defeated, took a candle from Bailey and stepped into the corridor. Her figure stiffened. She gave an audible gasp of dismayed surprise. "Quick!" she cried, turning back to the others and gesturing towards the corridor. "A man just went through that skylight and out onto the roof." End of chapter 18. Recording by Alan Winterroud. boomcoach.blogspot.com